Hello, my friends. I wanted y'all to come into the garden today because I wanted you to see this beautiful, this is called a bishop's cap. Look how pretty that is. And if we're lucky, a little hummingbird has been darting in and out of here today. So you might get to see the hummingbird. So I wanted to read you guys this book. It's a very special book that my sister Cindy gave to me. It's called Peter's First Easter. Now it's the Easter story, but this is what you call historic fiction. So it's the true story from the Bible, but they add in some of the things that people said that we don't know that they said them exactly like that. So it just makes it a little easier for us to understand. And I really want you guys to see the pictures for a couple reasons. One is because they're beautiful. The pictures are really beautiful. But also it kind of helps us to picture, like when Jesus was eating with his disciples, he wouldn't have been sitting in chairs like we do. They would have been at a low table, and they would have been sitting and kind of reclining, and they would actually lean against each other. So it's a little bit different. They would be sitting like on pillows on the floor. You'll get to see that in here and kind of see what some of their dishes look like and their buildings. One of the first pictures right here shows what the town would have looked like, which is pretty cool. So they had, these buildings were flat on top, and this roof up here was actually a whole other room of the house. That was considered a room of the house. And some different Bible stories will take place up on that roof of the house. So I'll read the words, and then I'll just turn around and let you see the beautiful pictures. Now this story is told as if it's Peter talking, and we know Peter was one of Jesus' best friends, one of his disciples. And a disciple is someone who learns under someone. So I am a disciple of Brother Clark and Brother Noel. I learned from them. And Miss Shirley and Dr. Betty and different people, Miss Ida, that I learned from. You guys are disciples. When you're in my class, you're like you're disciples of me. You're learning from me and from Miss Brandy. So these were Jesus's disciples, and the one who's going to be telling the story is Peter. Now Peter's one of my favorite characters in the Bible, because I think I'm a lot like Peter. Peter really, really loved Jesus with all his heart, but sometimes he didn't always think before he spoke. We talked about the story when Jesus was walking on the water, and Peter said, let me walk on the water. And he got out on the water, and he was walking like Jesus, and then he started looking around at the storm and the waves and the wind and the lightning, and he got scared and he started to sink. Well, I just think I'm a lot like Peter. Sometimes I really, really love Jesus, but I do things before I think about them, and then I have doubts like Peter had when he was in the middle of the storm. So I like to hear a story through Peter's eyes because I just can really relate to him. So this is called the Last Supper. We talked about this last week when we looked at the Easter eggs, where Jesus had that last meal with his disciples, with his friends, and how when we have the Lord's Supper, we are remembering that. Jesus was sad when we climbed the stairs. He was sad when we entered the upper room and took our places around the table. He was sad when we started to eat. But I didn't notice how sad he was until he opened his mouth and he spoke these terrible, terrible words. It was Thursday night, 1 hour after sunset. The windows and doors were locked. Lamp flames sent shadows into the corners of the room. Outside in the night, there were people looking to arrest Jesus, but inside we were safe. We were like a family, you know, his disciples, his closest friends. Jesus was our Lord and our teacher, and we loved him. Well, but in those days, I figured I loved him the most because he'd given me a special name. I am Simon, the son of John, but Jesus called me Peter, which means rock. He said I was like a big stone, the kind that you could build a building on. Oh, I loved him sometimes that it made me laugh out loud. So there they are, and they're having that meal, and you see how they're sitting on the ground on pillows around the table. I also love to eat. That's what I was doing Thursday night, and that's why I didn't notice Jesus' sadness. I was eating roasted lamb and bread as thin as crackers. I was eating some leaves that were so bitter they made my nose run, but I dipped them in a fruit sauce to make the bitterness go away. I was chewing and swallowing when suddenly Jesus said, "One of you is going to betray me." I stopped eating, and I saw that there were tears in Jesus' eyes. He was so sad. And these are the terrible words he said, "This very night, One of you will lead my enemies to me. They will tie me up and they will kill me." "What? Kill Jesus?" All of us sat still and stared. Some of us said, "Is it me? Is it me, Jesus?" Only one of us just kept eating. John sat between me and Jesus, so I nudged him and I nodded toward the Lord. Jesus knew what I meant. He leaned upon Jesus and whispered, "Who, Lord? Who would do such a thing?" Slowly, Jesus took the bitter leaves and he reached to a dish of fruit sauce. Judas Iscariot, the only disciple still eating, was dipping his own leaves in the dish. Jesus said, "The one who is dipping with me, he will betray me." Judas dropped the leaves and snatched his hand away. He bared his teeth in a grin. "Me, Lord? Me? You don't mean me?" Jesus said, "What you have to do, go. Do it quickly." Right away, Judas got up. He tried to say something, but instead he opened the door and he went out into the night. So there they are. They're there with Jesus. They're eating the bread and the bitter leaves. No one moved. Chilly breezes caught the lamp flames and caused them to flicker. Shadows troubled Jesus' face. I jumped up and I slammed the door. Jesus ate nothing that night, yet he commanded us to eat and to drink. He took some bread and he blessed it and broke it and gave it to us, saying, "Take this, eat it." We did, but while we were chewing the bread, he said, "This is my body." His body? "Oh Lord, how could I swallow your body?" Next he took a cup of wine and he thanked God and he said, "Drink this, all of you." We obeyed, but again while we were taking little sips, he said, "This is my blood, poured out for the forgiveness of sins." Body and now blood? Who could forget such a meal? My heart was hammering inside of my chest. Surely this would be a night like no other. An hour later, we were all walking down the dark streets of Jerusalem. For as long as 10 minutes, Jesus prayed out loud. "Father," he said, "keep my friends safe from the evil one." And remember that here he's praying for his disciples, but he's also praying for you and me, because he already sees us. When he was done praying, he walked on in silence, thinking. He went through a city gate and across the Kidron Valley. Then we began to climb a path up the Mount of Olives. Suddenly, Jesus said, "You are all going to run away from me tonight." Sometimes my feelings are so strong that I talk before I think. I shouted, "Not me, Lord, not me. Everyone else might run away, but I never will." Jesus came and put his hand on my shoulder and looked at me with his sad eyes. "Peter," he said, "Peter, you will do worse than run away. Before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will deny me 3 times. "No," I said, "no, not even if I have to die. I will never deny you." And to deny him means to say that he doesn't know him, he never met him. Chapter 3 is called On the Mount of Olives. When we reached the top of the mount, Jesus told the disciples to wait in the clearing while he prayed. Then he took John and James and me with him into the Garden of Gethsemane. What was that sound? It sounded like wind in dead trees. What was it? It was Jesus. He was groaning while he walked. Oh. Finally he stopped. He told us to sit down, but he kept on standing. Under 1,000 stars, I could see sweat on his forehead, sweat as thick as blood. "Oh, my friends," he groaned, "I am scared to death. Please keep watch with me." Then he walked off into the trees. But you see, they didn't keep watch. They fell asleep. At first there was silence. Then there was a heavy thud on the ground and groaning. Jesus had fallen down. I almost jumped up and ran to him. But then I heard his voice, and I left him alone. He was crying, "Daddy, Daddy." Jesus was sobbing like a little boy. "Oh, Father, take this cup of suffering away from me." Over and over, softer and softer, he said those words, like singing. I began to feel woozy in my head. He said, "But you, my God, let your will be done, not mine." That's the last I heard. I cuddled against John's back and I listened to the breezes and I drifted. The next thing I knew, Jesus was standing over us, saying, "Get up, my betrayer is coming." He turned and walked out of the garden. My whole body was tingling. The air was full of dreamy sounds, metal clanging, feet marching. What was happening? Oh no, I'd been asleep. I jumped up and I ran after Jesus. And right away I saw the soldiers coming up the mount with torches and swords. And here were the disciples all huddled together. And in the middle stood Judas Iscariot, grinning. As soon as he recognized Jesus, he raised his hand and hollered, "Hello, Master!" The idiot was yelling as though they were miles apart. Now he crept toward Jesus, grinning and blinking and crouching like a dog. When he was face to face with Jesus, Judas Iscariot went up on his toes and said, "My dear teacher," and he kissed him. One of the soldiers shouted, "That's the man, then!" Judas stepped away, and the soldier came forward with a rope, and I went crazy with rage. I pulled out my sword, and I ran at the soldier, and I slashed his ear clean off of his head. A bad swing. This time I took deadly aim. But before I could attack, someone grabbed me from behind, someone very strong. He stripped the sword from my hand and yanked my arms back. "Everyone who takes the sword shall die by the sword." It was Jesus. All my bones went as soft as soup. I said, "I'm only trying to help." But Jesus moved past me. He picked up the ear that I had cut off, and he touched it to the side of the soldier's head and healed it. Now this is how bad the world was that night. The soldier whom Jesus had healed seized him, tied him tightly with the rope, and the disciples who loved him, they all ran away. Here's Judas, and he told the soldiers, "The one I kissed, that's the one." So here he is kissing Jesus, and then this is the soldier whose ear that Jesus cut off. No, that Peter cut off, and Jesus healed. Chapter 4 is called "In the Courtyard of the High Priest." Me? Well, I didn't exactly run away from Jesus. I followed him, secretly. I snuck down dark alleys, keeping up with the tramp of the soldiers' feet. It was long past midnight. The stars were gone. A cold wind blew through Jerusalem. The city was dark and sleeping. All but the house of the high priest, where people were gathered with noise and torchlight. It was to that house, high on Zion, that the soldiers led my dear Lord Jesus. When they arrived, the iron gate swung open, and they all marched into the courtyard. Just as the gate was closing, I saw John slip inside. "John," I called, running to the bars. "John, let me in." He heard me, but he pretended that he didn't. "John, it's me, Peter." He motioned for me to shut up, then moved to a young maid and murmured something behind her ear. She glanced my way. When she turned to see who had spoken, John had vanished. Frowning then, she stared hard at my face. The maid came to the gate and opened it. I walked in as if I belonged there, but she just kept staring. That girl was like a mosquito. She circled closer and closer. All at once she clapped her hands and exclaimed, "Yes, I do know you. You are a friend of the prisoners." She poked a soldier and pointed to the window of the room. We could see Jesus standing there. "This man," she said, meaning me, "is with that man in there." When the soldiers started staring at me, I growled like a lion. "I don't know what she's talking about." Then I got up and I stalked across the courtyard to the window where Jesus was. It didn't take me long to realize that horrible things were happening in that room. People were screaming, "He's guilty! He's guilty! He said he would destroy the temple itself." I saw the high priest raise an oil lamp to Jesus' face and say, "I command you to tell me the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Are you the Christ, the Son of God?" The room fell silent. Jesus gazed directly into the high priest's eyes and said, "I am." "Blasphemy," said the high priest, as if someone had slapped him. He smashed the lamp and began to rip his clothes. "Jesus of Nazareth has sinned against the Most High God," he said. "What is your verdict? What shall we do with this man?" "Kill him! Kill him!" the people yelled. They hit Jesus. They spit on him and they yelled, "Put him to death!" How could I watch this and do nothing? I was trying to figure out what to do when someone suddenly touched my arm. I jumped straight up and I whirled around and I found 3 soldiers and a servant all glaring at me. The one who touched me said, "The maid was right. You are one of his followers." "Not me," I shouted. "I swear to you I'm not." But the servant grabbed my sleeve and said, "Liar, I saw you. The man whose ear you cut off, that was my cousin." This was more than I could take. I cursed and I swore and I roared, "I've never even met the man named Jesus." With all my might, I tore my sleeve from the servant, and I spun around. There in the window, I saw Jesus staring back at me. His eyes were so sad, so very sad. And then the rooster crowed. Maybe everyone in the world could hear that rooster crowing. Surely Jesus heard it. He looked at me with tears in his eyes. So I started crying too, and I started to run. Oh, I was a bad man now. I ran through the courtyard. I ran out the gate. I ran into the alley, and there I fell down on the ground and I cried. All night long, a man was lying in the dark, dark alley of Jerusalem, and that man was me. There's the rooster crowing, just like Jesus said it would, and there's poor old Peter, just crying through the night. Chapter 5 is called Hiding. I was such a bad man now. I didn't deserve for people to like me. They shouldn't even look at me. So at dawn on Friday, I went into hiding. But let me tell you something. I still love Jesus. Do you understand this? I wanted to be close to him. So wherever the soldiers took him, I followed, sneaking from place to place like a rabbit, like a robber, like the ugliest person in all the world. The ugliest, yes. A year ago, Jesus had called me the ugliest name there is. At the time, I thought he was wrong, but now I guess he was probably right. He had been teaching, you see, teaching us the grand plan for his life. That he would go to Jerusalem, that he would suffer many things, and that he would be killed. Killed! Well, from that moment on, I hated that plan, and I told him so. He was still teaching, and after 3 days, he was saying, I will rise again. But I wasn't listening. I walked straight up to him and I said, God forbid that should ever happen to you. Jesus snapped his mouth shut. His eyes sparked with fire and he said, Get behind me, Satan. If you hate this plan, you hate the ways of God. I came to give my life away for many people. Satan. Jesus had called me that ugly name, the name of Satan. How could I let anyone look at me if he was right? That's why I hid myself all day on Friday, but I never stopped loving Jesus, and that is why wherever he went, I followed. And there are the soldiers taking Jesus away, and there's our friend Peter. Chapter 6, at the governor's palace. Friday morning was gray and cold and wet. Even before the city woke up, the priests and soldiers led Jesus to the palace of the Roman governor. Pontius Pilate, the high priest said, come out and judge this man, this Jesus of Nazareth. He is guilty of crimes deserving death. The governor came out with a sneer on his face. He didn't like us Jews very much. He sat down in a big chair and said, it's raining. Hurry up. Tell me what you think, why you think he should die. For one, said the high priest, he tells people not to pay taxes to the emperor. For another, he says he's a king, Jesus the king. Pontius Pilate leaned forward to take the measure of this criminal. He gazed at the thin man with steadfast eyes and raindrops in his hair. The man was shivering in the cold. His face was bruised. The ropes cut into his skin. But he looked back at the Roman with no rage, no hate, just patience and a perfect knowing. Pilate said, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus said, you say that I am. Pilate squinted more closely at Jesus. Then he sat back and he waved his hands to shoo the priests and the soldiers away. Go home, he said. I don't find any fault with this man. The high priest climbed halfway up the governor's steps and said, look closer, sir. He stirs up the citizens. He causes riots against your government. More and more people were gathering now. The high priest turned to them and cried, you know the evil of Jesus, don't you? Oh, he's a sly one, the people shouted. Disloyal. Right. He breaks the laws of Moses and of Rome. You see, said the high priest to Pilate, he's a rebel. He's a dangerous man. Pilate said to Jesus, how do you answer these charges? But Jesus stayed silent. Pilate said, have you nothing to say for yourself? Nothing. Jesus stood there like a white column, calm and kind. Now that's Pontius Pilate. And here he is when he's talking to Jesus. And Jesus just looks at him, just calmly. Okay, he said to the high priest, I know what I'm going to do. I will release one prisoner, and I will let you choose which one. Shall I release the murderer named Barabbas, or shall I release Jesus, the King of the Jews? It was a trick, and I liked it. Barabbas was wicked. He truly belonged in jail. Surely no one would want him free on the streets. They had to pick Jesus. Pontius Pilate stood up to address the entire crowd. It was amazing how many people had come out in the drizzling rain. "Which man?" he called. "Which man do you choose?" Immediately the people shouted, "Give us Barabbas." Pilate was shocked. "Then what shall I do with Jesus of Nazareth?" he said. Louder than ever, the huge crowd thundered, "Crucify him!" Why? What evil has he done? The high priest now stood equal with Pilate. "By our law he ought to die because he called himself the Son of God." Pilate cried, "Your laws are not my laws. You deal with him yourself." Then the high priest delivered his final threat. "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar's. Anyone who makes himself a king is an enemy of the real king, Caesar." Pontius Pilate looked scared at that. 1,000 people were ready to riot, screaming, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" So the Roman governor sat down and he shrugged his shoulders. He released the evil Barabbas, but Jesus he ordered to be whipped and then crucified. And there are those crowds screaming, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Chapter 7 is called On Golgotha. What did I see that Friday? What sorrowful things did I witness? I saw my Lord Jesus bowed and bloodied, trying to carry a heavy beam of wood. Criminals are supposed to carry part of their cross up to the place of their dying, but Jesus kept falling down. So the soldiers commanded another man to carry the beam to the little hill called Golgotha. And what did I see? I saw the soldiers lay my Jesus down on the ground. They stretched his arms to the end of the beams, and they pounded spikes through his bones into the wood. I saw them lift the whole beam up with Jesus hanging on it, up to the top of a very strong pole. They put a sign there that said, "Jesus, King of the Jews." Then they came down and they spiked his ankles to the pole. It was misty cold. The wind was blowing. All of Jesus' ribs were showing through his skin like a skeleton. But I heard him say this holy thing. He looked up, and then he looked down at the people around him, and he said, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." It was so holy I could hardly breathe. But the people, they were laughing. They were pointing at him and sneering. "You saved others, but you can't save yourself." There were 2 thieves crucified with Jesus, one on his right and one on his left. The man on his left was laughing with everyone else. "Hey, you, Christ, save yourself and save me too." But the man on the right said, "What is the matter with you? You and I deserve to die, but this man did nothing wrong." Then he lowered his voice and he whispered, "Jesus, please remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus looked at that thief and he said, "I promise you, today you will be with me in paradise." There he is talking to that thief. And that thief did the 3 important things that we keep talking about. He admitted he was a sinner. He said, "We deserve to be here." He confessed that Jesus is God's son. He said, "This man did nothing wrong." Well, the only person who's never done anything wrong is Jesus. And then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." So he was giving his life to Jesus. And Jesus told him, "You'll be in heaven with me today." I, Simon Peter, hiding from everyone and everything. I wish Jesus were speaking to me. Now the clouds grew thicker and darker. A true rain started to fall. People ran back into the city until the only ones left on that wet hill were the soldiers, a few women, and just one man. No, it wasn't me. It was John. Among the women were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus. "Woman," he said to his mother. She was crying so hard that John had to hold her up. "Woman," Jesus said, "let the man beside you be your son." And to John he said, "She is your mother." Hugging her tightly, John led Mary away from such sorrow. And then almost no one was left on Golgotha. Now the clouds in the heavens shut down like a door, and the world became as dark as night. And out in the darkness came a loud voice crying, "My God, my God." It was Jesus. I couldn't see him, but I could hear his voice rise up into the sky. My God, why have you forsaken me? No one answered. No one answered him. I covered my face and I did not move for an hour, for 2 hours. Then I heard my Lord Jesus murmur 2 soft words. He said, I'm thirsty. So I crept out of my hiding place and I took a sponge and I filled it with vinegar and I stuck it on a stick and I reached it up to Jesus' mouth and he drank. He drank, but he didn't know it was I. He didn't know that I was there. When he was done drinking, Jesus sighed. It is finished. Then he said a little prayer, the one that children say before they go to sleep. Father, he said, into your hands I place my spirit. What did I see that Friday? What did I witness? I saw the head of Jesus sink down between his shoulders. I saw his body sag. I heard a long, long breath go out of his mouth. And I waited, but I never heard another breath go into him again. Jesus was dead. And here's Peter. He's holding up that sponge for Jesus to drink. Chapter 8 is called The Tomb. They buried him. On the Friday of my hiding, just before the sun went down, a man named Joseph came and lowered the body of Jesus from the cross. He wrapped him in a long white linen cloth and carried it into his own tomb, a grave carved into solid stone. Joseph rolled a flat stone like a wheel against the door to the tomb, and then he went away. Alone then, I went to that flat rock, and I touched it. I touched my name, Peter, the rock. But what good is a stone that no one could build a building on? What good is a stone that can only shut in a dead man? Oh, Peter, what is to become of you now? There they are, lowering Jesus' body. Chapter 9 is called Sunday Morning. For me, Saturday was a dead and dreadful day. One by one, all the disciples snuck back to the upper room where we'd eaten with Jesus on Thursday, all but Judas. We locked the door and we blew out the candles so no one could tell we were there. We were scared. We had hoped that Jesus was the Redeemer of Israel. But he died, and with him, all of our hopes died. We didn't eat. We didn't talk. We sat in sadness and darkness all alone. Then someone started to bang on the door. I thought the soldiers had come, until a person yelled, Peter! Peter! It was a woman's voice. Go away, I said. Peter, open the door. It's me, Mary Magdalene. I cracked the door. Light burst into the room. Why, it was morning. It was Sunday morning. I said, hush, woman, the soldiers will hear you. Oh, Peter, Peter, you donkey, Mary laughed. She was with James's mother and Joanna and Salome. They were all laughing. The angels, she said. The angels have sent us with a message. Oh, Peter, come on. Come and see what we have seen. Mary pulled me down the steps and made me run through the city with her. We went to the tomb, she said. We went to the tomb to rub oil on Jesus' body. But when we got there, the stone was rolled away and the tomb was empty, Peter. Oh, we were so scared. But then there was an angel, and he told us not to be afraid. He said, you're looking for Jesus, but he isn't here. He's risen, just as he promised. And here's Peter running through the streets. And that is important because dignified men did not run back then. Mary burst out laughing again and ran ahead of me all the way to the tomb. Look inside, she said. I did. I saw the linen cloth lying by itself, but nothing else. No body was there, either living or dead. So what was I supposed to think? I stood up, more scared than ever. Mary said, Peter, don't you remember his promise that he would rise again on the third day? I pushed her out of my way and I ran as fast as I could to the upper room again. I slammed the door and locked it. Mary was a fool. I was scared because if our enemies would steal the body of Jesus, surely they would kill us too. And there's Peter and Mary looking in the tomb. When the evening came, Thomas said at last we ought to eat something. So we went out to find some food while we gathered about, where we argued about whether to light a lamp or not. All at once, Jesus was in the room with us. He frightened us. We all backed away. He said, peace be with you. And that made things worse. This was a ghost that could talk. But then he did 3 things. He opened his hands and he showed us the scars from the spikes. He sang the beautiful words again, almost as though they were a lullaby. Peace be with you. and he smiled at us. He smiled like in the olden days, and he smiled in a new way too. He smiled like the morning sun at the beginning of the world. John started to giggle. James swatted his leg and laughed out loud. Soon all the disciples were laughing until tears ran down our cheeks. So glad they were to see Jesus. Yes, it was the third day. Yes, he had risen from the dead. He said, "Just as the Father sent me into the world, so I am sending you. Go out and do my work." Then he came near and he breathed on each of us and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. The sins you forgive are forgiven." Well, not all the disciples laughed. For one, Thomas wasn't even there, and when the others told him what happened, he wouldn't believe them until Jesus came again a week later and proved to Thomas that he really was truly alive. And another one, me. I couldn't laugh with the others because I didn't know what Jesus thought of me now. I was the one, you see, who'd sworn that he had never ever met Jesus. I was so afraid for my life that I denied him 3 times. I was so glad he was alive again, and I never stopped loving him. But I didn't laugh. I hid behind James and John. Look how happy the disciples are to see Jesus. Chapter 10, Fishing and Forgiveness. Here now is the last part and the best part of my story. After we saw Jesus in the upper room, many of us traveled back to Galilee where we used to live. Then just yesterday afternoon, I said that I was going fishing. It's the job I had before Jesus came to us and said, "Follow me," and we became his disciples. So James, John, Thomas, and 4 more men went with me to the seashore. In the evening, we sailed out on the water and we cast our nets. They would cast the nets out to catch the fish. It wasn't a good trip. We spent the whole night casting, but by morning, we'd caught exactly nothing. Then someone called from the shore, "Children, do you have something to eat?" "No," I shouted back, yanking my nets in for the last time. "Tell you what," the man said, "cast your nets on the right side of the boat and see what happens." "Right side, left side, what's the difference?" I grumbled. Who did this amateur think he was? We did this for a living. But John, who's forever cheerful these days, called out, "Okay," and he obeyed the stranger. Well, as soon as John's net hit the water, so many fish jumped in it, it began to drag the whole boat down. "Peter," John's eyes were sparkling, "don't you know who that is?" Who? Who do you guys think it is? It's the Lord. Sometimes my feelings are so strong I act before I think. The Lord? I jumped in the water and I swam to shore. Yes, it was Jesus. He had built a fire and he said, "Help them bring the fish in and let's eat." I did. In that single catch that morning, we had landed 153 fish. A happy day. We took several of the best fish, cleaned them, broiled them, then we lay down on the grass to eat. Isn't that a pretty picture? See, here's the disciples with Jesus eating. There's the lake and beautiful flowers. Just like these flowers. This time my eating did not keep me from noticing Jesus' face. I think I took maybe 1 bite before I saw that he was not eating, just like last time. But the difference was, he was staring straight at me and no one else. Oh, my face burned like a fire then, and the fish stuck in my throat. I couldn't chew, I couldn't swallow. I hung my head, scarcely breathing. After a while, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He didn't call me by my special name. I didn't look at him. I whispered, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." He said, "Feed my lambs." He didn't say anything for almost a minute, but he kept looking at me, and I just kept looking at the ground. Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" I whispered, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." He said, "Tend my sheep." No one was eating now. I was shaking. When Jesus spoke again, the tears spilled down from my eyes. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" 3 times. It was exactly the number of times I denied him. That's why I was crying now. "Oh, Lord, you know all things," I said, so softly that maybe he didn't even hear me. "You know that I love you." Well, when I said that, Jesus leaned over and he put his arms around me and hugged me so tightly that I burst into big boo-hoos, crying like a baby, crying for happiness, crying for sheer, pure happiness. He lifted me up and put me on my feet. He gazed into my eyes and he gave me a job to do for the rest of my life. Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." I don't know. That's what happened just this morning. And I've run as fast as I could to tell you this good news. Jesus has forgiven me. 3 times I hurt him, and he took my hurt, and he went down to death with it. Then when he arose from the dead, the hurt was gone. And I was so sorry for what I'd done. He came, and he loved me 3 times back again. And now I have so much love that I can love you just like Jesus loves. Forgiveness. You and I can both be forgiven. How do I know? When we were done eating, Jesus smiled and said the very same thing he said the first time he called me Peter. He said, "Peter, you know, like a big stone." "Peter," he said, "follow me." Sometimes my feelings are so strong I talk before I think. "Yes," I said. "Yes, Jesus, I will follow you forever." All right, my friends, that's the end of a story, the most important story that I could ever tell you. I want you guys to have a happy Easter. I miss you. I love you. I hope we'll all be together soon. And I want you to remember this story and remember why it's so important to us. See you guys soon, okay? Be good.